Hey everyone, and welcome back to the College Essay Guide podcast. Tom Campbell here, former independent school college counselor and Pomona and Holy Cross admissions officer, current podcast co-host and breakfast burrito addict. Speaking of nutrition, I'm excited to share some chicken nuggets of wisdom alongside my amazing colleague Hanah Lim, a former public school English teacher and College Essay Guide's director of workshops, all about recommendation letters specifically for counselors and teachers. While our last What Colleges Want episode focused more on how admissions officers evaluate rec letters, today's is a much more practical how-to guide for school counselors and teachers to actually write the darn thing, and ideally not have it consume every waking minute during your busy fall application season. Hanah and I will get into how your school's context and your caseload and capacity influence the way admissions officers evaluate your letters, how the three pillars of school advocacy, the school profile, counselor letter, and teacher letters, can distinctly and harmoniously capture the full breadth of your students' awesomeness, best practices for counselors and teachers around writing recs, from length and formatting to content and style, a detailed walkthrough of our own letter writing processes, and we'll wrap things up with various exercises and tools, yes, including AI, to make writing letters more efficient and maybe even more enjoyable. All right, that last one may be a stretch, but hey, flexibility is key. Before we dive into the content, let's meet Hanah. Hanah Lim oversees College Essay Guide's essay and application workshop team. Leveraging her background as an English teacher at her alma mater, Cerritos High School, Hanah developed our workshop curriculum to be interactive, engaging, and collaborative, the ultimate trinity in capturing Gen Z's attention. Every year, her and her team lead workshops for thousands of students at community-based organizations, public, international, and independent schools all over the world, as well as professional developments for schools, CBOs, and even districts. She's worked as a college consultant for students in Bangkok, Thailand, directed SAT prep centers in Irvine, California, and worked with nonprofit groups and as an avid teacher and coordinator to help close the achievement gap. Hanah finds joy in watching musicals, visiting Disney parks with her husband, and playing with her two cats. We hope you enjoy the episode.
So when I was in high school, I never would have thought that I would come back to teach at my own school. I was definitely a wallflower at my school. Even when I came back to teach there, I think some of my colleagues now didn't even realize that they had me as a student because I was so shy. Once I got into my teaching program, I felt like, gosh, I want to be that adult role model that I didn't have when I was a student. And so I had some really inspiring role models who were my English teachers that I really wanted to be like and really come back and work with. And so, yeah, it was amazing to get that opportunity. You know, growing up in the public schools ever since, I was young, I was used to 30 plus students being in every class, having 100, almost 180 students per year was normal. It wasn't until I started working with College Essay Guide and meeting so many different types of schools as a director of workshops that it's like, whoa, your entire junior class was how many students I had a year, like that. It was really interesting to see the differences. And I was able to really just go with it because that's all I knew. And so when I would get all these requests, because I wasn't just an English teacher, I taught junior English, and I taught senior AVID. And so AVID is a program that helps like the middle students who tend to like fall between the cracks, oftentimes they're first gen students. And so that was a very college going, goal oriented class. And so I wrote a lot of letters, so I got a lot of students coming back, requesting letters from me. And so when I would get all these requests, like how to write letters and the expectations of these letters was not something that was taught in my teaching program. And so I learned a lot from you in validating that I've been steering my students on the right course, I guess. But yeah, lots of experiences, lots of trial and error in terms of like learning like what the students know, what they don't know, and having to adjust to that. Sometimes they would ask me for a letter of rec and I find out they're only applying to Cal States. And it's like, oh my goodness, like how can I prevent this in the future? So all these things, so it was not the most favorite part of my job because I think a lot of students think they're entitled to this. This is part of our job. When actually, when you ask us the night before, it's actually not part of our job.
Right. I love hearing about that kind of goal of wanting to go back and be a role model and kind of like provide some of the insight that you didn't have as part of your own student experience. My mom, is an inner city public school teacher, and she taught for literally decades in the Springfield public school system in Springfield, Massachusetts. So a lot of the challenges that, we have in our education system that all of you, counselors and teachers tuning in, I know are very familiar with. And it impacts our the schools that we work at and the communities that we work in very differently. Something that I think in comparing our both of our experiences in the schools that we've worked at, I was at that kind of contrast school, right? Where it actually was a decently large school for an independent school. The nuanced questions that students and families have, and, so many, especially the community I was working in, students who were it wasn't an avid program, right? It was a lot of students who were aiming for these highly selective elite schools where, in the spirit of the NACAC report, right? Like, and this podcast, how much do letters of recommendation weigh? The answer is it depends, right? And, we've worked with students, both of us have worked with students who are aiming for those highly rejective schools. And those are those schools where, in this NACAC report, where the letter of recommendations for teachers and counselors are around 10% of colleges mark them as considerably important. It's typically those more selective schools where these letters are maybe used a little bit more meatily, used a little more substantially in the review process, but not to a degree that should make anyone, regardless of the school that you're coming from, feel pressured to like write your kid into a college, because that's just not how it works, right? Mm-hmm. Hopefully this podcast series and the NACAC data and reports have clarified that rec letters are a component of many in the holistic review process, but that regardless if you are working at a Cerritos or a Lakeside or somewhere in between there, right? You can only commit to what you can commit to based on your capacity, your time, the role that you have, and the multiple hats that you may be juggling. And know that the person in admissions, this is, I say, like one of the biggest, teaching moments that I want to really drill home. And it's something that we talked about in the previous podcast episode with Aisha King, is the reality that it's very rare for a letter of rec to be this real big tipping point for a student's admission process. It's usually a point of consistency. It's usually a point of clarification. There's context that is provided. There's nuance that can be uncovered and unpacked a little more than if the letters were not present at all. But in general, they're usually communicating themes that a student themselves have been revealing in their applications in some way, shape, or form, their activities, right? The classes that they've taken. I'd love to hear a little bit from you, Hanah, about kind of that revelation when we kind of both were so both Hanah and I, we co-run a letter of recommendation professional development for different schools and community-based organizations. And when we were putting it together, but first of all, shout out for workshops and the professional development. They're awesome. And if you're curious, we can definitely share more in the show notes about getting signed up with, either myself or Hanah or someone from our team going in and looking at your letters of recommendation and providing tips and guidance that's tailored to your school community. But anyway, I digress. One of the big revelations you shared with me was like looking at my sample letters that I was including in the PD and then yours, feeling a certain type of way. I don't want to reveal what it was. I'll let you do that. What was that like to see that comparison between letters and the style, I guess you could say, or the type of information that was included at that, more resourced, smaller, student ratio independent school versus a larger public high school?
Yeah. I mean, definitely the first shocking part for me was the length, just seeing the font size, even because I know that even for my letters of rec, sometimes if I didn't have that much to say about the student, I would literally increase the font size to make it, the page get filled in. And
oh yeah.
So I was literally thinking like, these public school kids don't have a chance if this is like all the, I guess, the support and resources that the independent schools are providing. But I really felt a little bit more at ease when you put it into context in terms of like that these are looked at within the context of where these folks are coming from. I also was surprised with how it really didn't look like a template was being used, because a lot of these students are applying to the same schools. Like you couldn't use a template. But as a, junior English teacher who have to grade, over 100 essays and write these letters, it just wasn't sustainable for me to write a letter from scratch for every single student. And so, at first I was a little surprised, but I think you put me at ease just kind of when we started talking about it.
Yeah, no, and definitely, I'm glad you feel that way. Of course, hopefully any of you tuning in, like that's a point that I really want to underscore, is that the bar, for lack of a better word, is different for different high schools. We'll segue a little bit into understanding more of that school context and understanding kind of like who's saying what when it comes to when the student's application is submitted, what else is coming along with it from the high school. and who ideally should be covering certain elements of who a student is, what the world that they're navigating, the environment that they're coming from, and anything that a college might need to know about that particular transition. Before we get into that, let's do some quick rapid fire FAQs about best practices of letters of recommendation, both for teachers and counselors. So first things first, let's talk length. In general, what's the best practice for the length of a letter of recommendation for college?
Yeah, ideally 1 to 2 pages is fine, single spaced. Ideally, trying to keep it within one would be amazing, but if it does go into the second page, that's completely fine too. Don't feel like you're trying to cut it down. Personally, when mine used to go into the next page, I did mess with the margins a little bit and the font size and all those things, just because I just feel like I don't want to overwhelm the reader also, second page. But
your readers appreciate that, from experience, I could say.
Because I just remember the times when I was working in test prep and running branches, like getting those really long resumes, it was like, oh, just keep it one page, please. So I know how that can be too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I love, the point about kind of like, if it does bleed over to the second page, it is fine. And I definitely want to underscore, like, you don't have the time as a teacher or counselor to be like editing substantially your own work. I don't recommend, for example, maybe this seems a little hypocritical for telling students, like, the drafting process is really important. You need to go from brainstorming to, outlining to that. As a rec letter writer, you don't have time for that. You just got to get the words on the page and then move on to the next one. So I definitely want to underscore, you can tweak with margins. You can feel compelled, personally, if you want to really get it to that one page, that's definitely your prerogative, but do not feel like you have to if it goes to the second page. And what about format? So, there are mixed opinions about, do people in admissions prefer letters that are written in a more traditional narrative style, or maybe a bulleted style with different sections or themes that either the counselor or teacher is covering for every student? Any tips around letterhead or kind of anything like that in terms of the actual presentation of the letter that's sent along?
Yeah, in general, definitely having a formal letterhead and including your information somewhere. Personally, I put my email at the bottom where my exit is. I didn't really have a signature because it was digital, but yeah, so I put that there. And even sometimes I would even wonder, like, okay, so how do we do the salutation? But yeah, a Dear Admissions Committee is completely fine. And a lot of colleges have indicated that they appreciate bulleted style letters. And so that's also fine too. I think something that we try to emphasize when we talk about even in PDs, where we're trying to coach folks on how to help their students with their essays, is to remember that the admissions readers are reading everything very quickly, and they need to read them very quickly. And so they don't have time to scrutinize how you said something. And so they just want to get the information. So even if it's in a bulleted style, that works too. And so just make sure that they have like headers so the sections make sense. But if it's easier for you to just write a traditional narrative letter, that's totally fine too. I feel like as an English teacher, I wouldn't be able to feel right about writing a bulleted style, but if you want to, that's totally fine. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, totally. Again, this is one of those areas where like it really depends on that personal preference and ease piece. For me, I tended to try and write my counselor letters with 3 particular themes, buckets with like bullets under them. So I would have headers that said academic and intellectual highlights, involvement and impact, and then character and context. You may or may not tell that I love alliteration. So involvement and impact, character and context. Apparently I missed the boat with academic and intellectual highlights, but again, I had to keep moving the train along. And lastly, before we kind of get into that school advocacy piece of the podcast and who is saying what, whose job is what, the teacher or the counselor, what about these letters in terms of like customization, right? How much should this letter be tailored to a particular college? Any advice for those tuning in on that question?
Yeah, just keep it, non-specific. It should be the same for each college. Don't mention specific ones. Every year, teachers and counselors mistakenly write the wrong school. So don't feel pressured to customize anything. They're all going to go to the same schools.
Just for those tuning in who are like, oh my God, like, what? That's horrible. Like the kids, maybe they didn't get in because I wrote Stanford instead of Pomona. It happened every year, multiple times, both from the students and the teachers and the counselors. So everyone was equal opportunity, to blame. But I just want to put out here that like, those are usually not situations that actually hurt a student. It's usually, I'll just, be very frank. Like usually what will happen is like we'll highlight it and like send it on like the team Slack, like the reader, like all of my colleagues and stuff, and just be like, LOL, like another one. And it's totally just the nature of reading hundreds of applications. But again, ideally you don't do that. It's just not, you don't want to be, you don't want to be the one put on blast in the admissions Slack channel at the college that your students are applying to. So if anything, that's the secondhand embarrassment you want to avoid. But no, your student's process will not heavily be impacted, but just, it's a good practice. Let's talk a little bit about the 3 pillars or tiers or components, I guess you could say, of school advocacy. And for most students who are applying to selective colleges, typically 3 distinct documents are sent along with their actual transcript, their grades, and that academic background. It's usually the school profile, the counselor letter of recommendation, and 1 or 2 teacher letters of recommendation. I'd say that's kind of the common standard trio, I guess you could say, for particularly the selective admission process. There are some exceptions, right? If you have a student who's only applying to University of California schools, Cal States, there's a few other schools that don't actually require recommendation letters or ask for them. So the first document that I think is actually, before we even get into rec letters, and do's and don'ts about what content is helpful, really want to spend a little bit of time talking about the school profile. Before even sitting down to write letters for your students for this coming cycle, really want to encourage counselors in particular who are tuning in. Teachers, you don't have to worry as much about this, but counselors, it's really, I'd say, important to nail that school profile. And we do have a piece that we'll share in the show notes, which is how to update your school profile post-SCOTUS, post the Supreme Court decision, and just the type of information, particularly for those of you who are working in schools where there are a substantial amount of students who identify as first generation and or low income, underrepresented students of color. It's often really valuable for people in admissions to understand what the journey has been like for those students when it comes to the school environment, resources that they have available to them or don't have available to them. And so the school profile really is that document, right? To give that macro level, it's the where. So, I like to say the school profile is the where, the counselor letter is the who, describing who the student is, and then the teacher letter is the how a student kind of like operates in a classroom, how the student lights up a space. That kind of insight, that eyewitness account, that primary source is definitely, I'd say, a teacher, an advantage to having teacher letters as part of this trio. With the school profile, it really is that broader where the student's coming from. So who attends the school? These are definitely things to include in the profile. Who attends the school? So information about demographics. What is the broader culture and community like? So is it a school where extracurricular activities are really common? Or, I had a colleague who used to read for schools in the Chicago area, and she said it was very common for students to actually go home at the end of the day because they had longer commutes. And at night, when it was dark out, actually sometimes those would be dangerous commutes, especially if they're on foot. So staying late at night to work on plays or, newspaper articles wasn't always as common for students coming from different schools. What is the college going culture like, right? So are students going widely to lots of different colleges or universities? Are they staying pretty close to home? Are they oftentimes going to 4-year colleges or 2-year colleges? What curriculum is available? AP, honors, IB classes? How, are there limits to how many advanced classes students can take? Things like that. Definitely great to include. What does academic achievement look like? So what's like a high GPA for that particular high school with that particular grading scale? Is it weighted or unweighted? Is there a grade distribution chart or kind of a scale that you can show for, this is typically the top students at our school. They typically have this range of GPAs, and then students in the middle, here's where they fall. And then lastly, just any particularities, things that kind of like in the school are like unique programs that you have. Like some schools have things like Project Lead the Way, or they have a unique dual enrollment partnership, or students do like cool hands-on internships or kind of collaborations with local companies. Like there really is a spectrum of what's offered in different high schools. So yeah, having that school profile really communicate the where is a big ask, or I think something that will, the more you can kind of nail that out and have it be really comprehensive, usually it's like a 2 to 3 page, I'd say, single space PDF document, the more the letters of rec are going to be able to spend time discussing the student and really kind of who they are when you've kind of covered the bases of the broader environment they're coming from through the school profile. And then switching gears right to the counselor letter, that is really going to be, the who. So who the student is in particular in that school environment. So are there notable contrasts between the student and the school community? So, this student's different from the typical peers here because they have to go home and care for their siblings after school. And in our school, that's not common because, most students don't have to do that. That would be an example of a contrast that's helpful because when we have the picture from the school profile of like the norm at the school, there's any ways a student defies that or their experience has been deviant from that. So helpful to know because this is the chance to individually highlight the student. Another key element of the counselor letter are key details about the student's home and family life and any challenges they may have gone through related to that. Sometimes when I've talked to teachers and counselors, they get a little worried about, I don't know if this is like too personal to share. And something that Aisha and I talked a lot about in our previous episode was how actually these personal details really do help someone who's reading and evaluating a student's candidacy understand the whole picture and any barriers the student may have been facing. So we actually, in our PD on this topic, we include an excerpt from a letter of rec that was shared by MIT on their website and their materials to help teachers and counselors best advocate for students. And the excerpt reads, Sanam is an outstanding young woman whose academic record may not fully reflect her ability. Her parents were divorced during her junior year, and for several years before that, her home situation had been in turmoil with a great deal of fighting between her parents. Her father has an alcohol problem, and Sanam certainly endured a great deal of emotional distress. The fact that she has been able to do as well as she has done, given the circumstances, says a lot about her. Now that the home situation has stabilized, her performance has improved, and I believe her senior year grades are a much better reflection of her ability. And MIT literally said on this point, you may wonder whether or not the above information is appropriate in this letter of evaluation. It is! Exclamation point. We appreciate anything that gives us insight and perspective into a student's performance and environment. Comments about problems that a student has experienced will help us understand the context in which they have accomplished whatever they have achieved. The extent to which they have dealt with these problems is useful to know as well. So again, really kind of giving the green light there for you as a counselor in that WHO letter to include these details. And of course, if a student tells you firsthand, hey, I'd rather you not, you have the information you have, and it's up to you as a professional who's advocating to a student to only share what they have told you they feel comfortable sharing in a questionnaire or in conversations with you, but also being that resource to also let them know, hey, I'm happy to keep this out of your letter. I do know, from experience that these are things and details that oftentimes people in admissions really do value, and really, it's really helpful for them to know, but your comfort level is first and foremost. So I think it's totally appropriate to mention that to students if that ever comes up. Another thing to include, in a counselor letter, best rule of thumb is how do the students' academics compare to the others in the school? So this is a big area for the counselor to spend a little bit of time and attention on, because again, if you're coming from a school where everyone has grade inflation, especially at a lot of independent schools and private schools, has become really common. And people in admissions know that. They're not naive. They understand when they can look at school history and see, oh, gee, the average GPA at the school is now a 98. That means that, I literally, there are schools that I know of where you're in the bottom half of the school group if you have below an A average. So in that environment, right, like how is someone in admissions going to really know who the stars are and who's really shining? So that's where details in your letter to be able to let someone in admissions know, oh, these are the courses that the student has taken at our high school. This course has a reputation for being one of the most challenging. Even details like, oh, this teacher is notorious for being a real harsh grader. Hanah, I don't know if you ever received that comment, but those were definitely details that were super helpful to read. And it also takes the pressure off the student for having to be like, hey, this teacher was really hard, because it sounds better when it's coming from the school. It sounds more, I guess, verifiable. So definitely any trends about the students' course choices or performance when it comes to grades and how that may compare to students in the environment is definitely really helpful to know. Any areas of impact, this is a huge one, right? So has the student made any a big difference in the school community, things outside of the school walls? Have they really committed to certain causes, certain things that really light them up, certain things that light a fire in them? I'm actually working on an exercise called Fire Starter right now, spoiler alert. So areas of impact that a student has committed to, also really great to include in the counselor letter. And the last two are going to be, what are the students' primary intellectual curiosities and their future goals? So if you have had, insight from a student as a counselor from, questionnaires they may have sent in, or from meetings you've had with them, or any notes from their file, if you have comments from their advisors or homeroom teachers or other counselors or advocates in the school, it's great to be able to share a little bit about where the student is falling right now academically, kind of what they're curious about, what they're thinking about, maybe possibly studying, or maybe what profession they're really called to right now. If they have any relevant experience connected to that, an internship, or they've done a Coursera course online to explore, a topic that they really love. Those are all, great examples of the details to include in that counselor letter. And now after me talking for, 25 minutes straight, Hanah, let's talk a little bit about the third pillar of the school advocacy trio, which is that teacher letter. So I like to say it's the how. I don't know if you would agree with that, but
Absolutely. So I remember when I would get these requests from students to write the letter, oftentimes they would be told to give me their resume. And it was just really odd because it's like, I can't speak on any of this other stuff that you've done outside the classroom, but I know how you were in my classroom. And so definitely when I would write the letters, I wanted to make sure that I was highlighting something about the student, making sure that like the purpose of the letter was to humanize the student for the reader. And so something that we talk about a lot in our PDs or in our workshops is that the application, let's say the common application or whatnot, is like the skeleton of the essay, that it's just kind of the bare bones, the numbers and all the achievements. But the letter is what, not just the letter, but any type of writing, whether it's the essay or the letters, are the things that kind of give it more life and like flesh and a soul. And so I love that the teacher letter gives that opportunity to humanize the student a bit more. And so in my letters of recommendation, I would just think about like, how am I almost like branding the student? And so it could be like the student's role in the classroom. So they could be like the challenger in the room, the intellect, the bridge builder. I had a student who really showcased intellectual curiosity. And so I know that like my school, it was a pretty diverse school, but there were certain stereotypes of different, like maybe Asian American students. I'm Asian American, so I can kind of speak on that a little bit more, where one of my students, he was an Indian student who wanted to go into computer science, but man, I loved how much he loved poetry. And I loved how he would like show that in my classroom. And so I wanted to, just like display those things, as English teachers and even as essay coaches, we say this to our students all the time, but the whole show, not tell. And yet, like a lot of like teacher letters or counselor letters are doing a lot of telling and not enough showing, I feel like. And so I feel like I'm giving the counselors a little bit of a break. I think the teacher letters could do a better job in, showing how they do this. And I feel like the teacher letter actually honed in on that a bit more. And so any light bulb moments or passion projects would be wonderful to highlight. Any interesting connections between the class and the academic subject or any other areas. So like, for example, that one student I was mentioning, I have his letter here. And I even talk about how the context of how I knew him. And I said in the second line, I had the joy of teaching David, not his real name, in his ninth grade English class, but I've been in touch with him every year to discuss his poetry and engineering pursuits, right? And so I've said that he's a one-of-a-kind student. And basically, I also put that I can see how David not only took education seriously, but applied it to real life immediately. And so I gave all these different anecdotes and things. And I feel like the show not tell part is so important. And even mentally having in mind that you have a purpose in what you're trying to show about the student.
Such great advice. And I think especially like when you're in admissions and you're reading a letter from a teacher and they can point to, oh, we did this unit on, beloved, and the student really connected to the material because it helped them explore their Black identity more. Like any times that you can kind of make connection between your class and material and things that you worked on and epiphanies that like a student had connected to that, that's like kind of what I think when you were saying like the light bulb moments, like that's what I think of as those as a reader.
Yeah. And just to give another example of showing it and just telling the audience here, is that not only did he love poetry, but I actually received an email from a national poetry contest saying that he had entered a poem from a project that we had and was going to be published into a book. And I was so surprised by his initiative to actually do that on his own, that he actually did that for like 3 years in a row, was telling me about the contest, that I actually ended up having students enter the same contest. So his like impact like really trickled down into some of my other students. And I actually was excited to write his letter because even though I taught him in ninth grade, I kept in touch with him because he wanted me to be an advisor for one of his clubs. And then, even though I was an English teacher, I didn't really feel drawn to doing it. But even though the club wasn't approved, he ended up being vice president of the other club that was too similar to his club, you know? And so it was like, I loved being able to like showcase these different anecdotes about my students and things. And that's just a glimpse of like the letter.
Yeah. And I think, really being able to like honor like a student's identities and kind of how they see themselves and any kind of like detail that you have around that, whether it's the counselor or the teacher, I think that that's so important. And it's actually, I'd say, even more pressing in today's current landscape. So, you may be tuning into this podcast in 2040 and who knows what rec letters are going to look like at that point. But, right now, a really big hot topic in the admissions profession, of course, is the Supreme Court decision on race conscious admission and the changes that colleges and universities now have to consider when they are thinking about who a student is and what they're contributing to the student campus or what they're contributing to a campus when it comes to their lived experience and identity. And sometimes that has to do with their socioeconomic background, their gender, their sexual orientation, class, but definitely race and ethnicity is a piece of that. But in today's landscape, there is a little bit more nuance as to how both teachers, counselors, and students can really kind of contextualize and discuss. And you can write and share whatever you want. What is important to note, though, is that only certain pieces of information can be utilized and discussed when it comes to a student's race or ethnicity when it's written in a certain way. And the Justice Department and the Department of Education have released a joint statement and guidance for schools and counselors and individuals supporting students who are applying to college around this point. So I just want to read an excerpt from that, which is: universities may continue to embrace appropriate considerations through a holistic application review process and provide opportunities to assess how applicants' individual backgrounds and attributes, including those related to their race, position them to contribute to campus in unique ways. For example, a university could consider an applicant's explanation of what it means to him to be the first Black violinist in his city's youth orchestra. An institution could likewise consider a guidance counselor or other recommender's description of how an applicant conquered her feelings of isolation as a Latina student at an overwhelmingly white high school to join the debate team. So this is literally included from guidance from these two departments of justice and Department of Ed, and they are green lighting recommendation letters from teachers and counselors as a primary source, an area of information for an admissions officer when doing a holistic review evaluation of considering a student's race and ethnicity, and in particular, how their race or ethnicity or their identity in general, can be connected to unique qualities or insights or how it's influenced that particular student and the campus that they're about to contribute. So that's definitely something I really want to put out there as a best practice for you all as counselors and teachers to think about. So, if a student, you may want to consider writing about a student's race or ethnicity if it relates to any of the following things. So an involvement in an identity-based activity, group, or organization. So if a student is active in a particular cultural club, or if they are, leading, I remember writing details about a student who did an assembly for the Latin Student Association, and kind of unpacking that, being, Hispanic or Latina is not a monolith. That was a big theme of the presentation. And I wrote about, it was so amazing to see her like on stage, like really just like sharing this information with such confidence and such pride, and really teaching our school community to be a lot more informed. Direct quotations from a student about their identity. So if they've shared, in survey questions or questionnaires, things about how their identity has impacted their school experience or their sense of self, it's great you can even include that direct quotation, in a letter of rec as well. And that's totally fair. Contextual comparison. So again, I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but if their experience, as a student who comes from a certain identity or background that's less represented in this community, sometimes they've voiced or shared with me that they felt isolated, or they've had to really work hard to find community, and here's how they've done that. And maybe they, are more involved with the resource center or club or organization outside of school to foster that solidarity. That'd be another example. If they are choosing colleges on their list that are really intentionally rooted or connected to an identity, right? Like, I have a student who's really looking for colleges that are on the Campus Pride Index because they're an LGBTQ student. and they're really looking for gender inclusive housing. And that's something that really is a big piece of them feeling excited for this next step in their lives and feeling accepted for who they are. That's a great tool to include to colleges to give them a sense of like, hey, this student is really thinking about what's the best environment for them. And they're being very intentional about the colleges they're choosing and factoring that in. And lastly, another thing that could potentially be something to include when it comes to a student's identity and a rec letter is connection to their, I kind of mentioned this with the beloved example, but I've had students who wrote, papers or projects in classes that were related to their identity in some way, their culture, and it helped them kind of come to an epiphany about their own academic interests or the things that the populations that they want to commit to when in college and try to spark change for and advocate for. So for example, writing a capstone paper on the U.S. internment of Japanese Americans was a way that, one student that I worked with talked about exploring her identity. So yeah, hopefully these kind of give anyone who's tuning in that green light. I know we're in a current era right now where this is a new ruling and people aren't really sure how much they can include when it comes to sensitive information that has become arguably more political in recent years. But definitely these are things that really do have a lot of value in the admission process. They are things that can really help students in this process as well. So anything that they've given you the green light to share or have shared with you that you can communicate along through your letter writing would be so, so wonderful. Why don't we switch gears a little bit and I'll have you take the mic first just because I just did a lot of talking. What about some just quick do's or quick don'ts, right? Let's maybe cover some things that just generally aren't always as helpful with rec letters. The caveat here that I want to mention is, again, as we said, you don't need to be going back and doing a lot of editing of your essays, your rec letters. And generally there's very little that you can share that would like really negatively impact a student's candidacy. So just want to put that out there. But these are some things that just in general aren't always as helpful as some of the things we mentioned before. So for teachers, what would maybe some of those details be?
Yeah, so something that may not be as helpful is including this like global information that's likely already going to be covered in the counselor letter. And so whether they're extracurriculars, course load, or in some instances, it might even be family circumstances. And so I mentioned earlier that sometimes students would give me the resume and you don't have to mention all those different things. The fact that they're taking 5 AP classes or whatnot, that's already going to be on the transcript. And so it's not your responsibility to talk about those things. But sometimes it just kind of depends too on the individual school. Like for example, on my letter request form, I do ask the students, was there anything going on in your life that may have affected your performance while you were in my class? And I would get students who would share some things that I had no idea about. And so I could have just talked about this great project that this student turned in or how she was a great leader, but I had no idea. And this is from a real example that she and her mom were pretty much couch surfing the entire time. And I had no idea. Like I never would have known that. And, I didn't know if the counselor would know that information too. And so I say this acronym sometimes, but high school, at least public school counselors are often bogged down with the STDs, the scheduling, testing, and discipline, that they don't really get to meet with the students who, may be super ambitious and like wanting to know their whole backstory. And so personally, I did include maybe like a line or two about that context if the student would let me know about that. So there's that. The other thing is like a lengthy overview of your own class and your subject material. It's not about you, it's about them. So it's a letter of rec for them. So you don't have to include anything about your class and how rigorous it is.
Right, or like, I went to this, college and I got my degree. Like I literally have read rec letters from teachers where there's a whole paragraph about their educational background and, their PhD theme. And I'm like, cool.
And you don't actually have to prove how good the student is at the content knowledge. The only time maybe you might want to address their academic, ability in your class is if their grade doesn't reflect it. And if there's some kind of contextual information you want to share to put that grade into context. So yeah, you don't have to hype the student up to talk about how great their grade is or anything if it's already a great grade.
Yeah, this is actually, when I share this with people, they're often really surprised, but a lot of times I actually wouldn't even remember the subject that the teacher taught. when I'm like moving through the letters and the speed that I'm reading them, I'm really kind of looking for those nuggets of like how they operate in the classroom and details and connections related to that. And sometimes that's, you'll get a clue like, oh, we were doing a unit on, the French-American War. Is that even a war? I don't know. So then obviously that's a history class, but that really wasn't my primary focus as an admissions reader on like, how good is this student at the subject that the teacher who's writing the letter is teaching. That wasn't really a goal that I had or a list of questions that I was like given as part of my review rubric. So that's definitely a great point to put out there, that it really isn't about their aptitude in that subject. And then Hanah, let's kind of move towards the final phase of this podcast episode, which is a little bit more about like the practical, like from point A to point B. How do you get from a student coming to you and asking for a rec letter to actually completing the darn thing, right? So I'll turn the mic over to you to talk a little bit about how you did that on the teaching side and some, things that you use, questionnaires or workflows that were able to help make this process maybe not as laborious as it could be if you're writing something, for example, from scratch every time or whatnot. So walk us through your brilliant workflow.
For sure. So something that I found to be extremely helpful was having a solid letter of recommendation request form. Because again, as I mentioned, I had almost 180 students a year, and I don't remember like what that particular student may have done or that one assignment that made them really shine. And so in my letter of rec form, basically I would ask them a series of different questions. And this is a form that really evolved throughout the years because sometimes students, as I mentioned earlier, would request a letter and then like not have schools that required letters. And so it was like, oh my goodness, I wrote this letter and it's not going anywhere. So the first thing I would ask them is like, obviously their name, but also the application due date. So I knew when they needed this by, some basic information, even like, why did you choose me to write your letter of recommendation? Because sometimes I was like, why are you asking me when you didn't do that great in my class? And then, so I started including that. And then they would write like, oh, because I feel like you would write a good letter and you'd do it on time. And it's like, okay, I kind of get that, but it was still like, and because I guess I was an English teacher specifically. And sometimes it was like really nice, some of the things they would say, like, I feel like you got to know me a little bit better. And, some of the students, I was not surprised that they were asking me. So it was just kind of nice to see like the impact, that I had made or whatnot. And so I also included a section that said like 2 to 3 projects or assignments you did in my class that you were proud of and why. And that one was so helpful just to kind of get those. That was probably the most important question to help me get some of the anecdotes, because it would kind of jog my memory actually, because it's, just so many years of different students. And so it was really, really helpful. Even if I just had them the previous year, it was so helpful. So, and then why they thought they were an outstanding student in my class. And then, as I mentioned before too, what was going on in your personal life and any other topics you might want me to address in the letter. Sometimes they would write certain things. I was like, I'm not going to address that because it's not my responsibility, So there were just a couple things there. And then, so after getting that information, so as I mentioned, I did not write my letters completely from scratch. Of course, in the beginning I did, but what I eventually had were different templates for different types of students, because not only was I the English teacher and the AVID teacher, but I was also an EL teacher for English language learners. And so I was also EL coordinator. And so I had letters specifically for like my EL students who would come to me oftentimes, because they would have me, but they would have another English class. So sometimes I would have them twice. And so some of these students worked so hard. And I wanted them to, like the schools to see like that them working hard, like in my junior English class, it was actually specifically, for example, American literature. These students they're like just learning American history now. So for them to learn some of these like basic things was like even harder. So that A that they got was like, they earned that grade. So I wanted to kind of like provide that context. So I had like an EL letter template. I had one for my AVID students, and then I had one for like my English students. And the way that I broke them up was, my initial impressions of the student, maybe like in the first paragraph, and like kind of, I hate saying thesis, but, basically like a quick preview of what they're about to read. And then I'll have like this, although some time has passed, here are several things that stay in my memory about the student. And it's often the anecdotes that they told me about, like the projects and things, you know. So I'd talk about that and then and then the next paragraph was about like why I'm impressed with the student. And then the next paragraph was about how the student stood out to me. And the last basic paragraph of, I'm certain the student will be so great at your institution, blah, blah, blah. And so I did give a series of probably generic adjectives at the end because I did ask the students to also give me adjectives and things. But whenever they did give me words, I did try to compare them to other students. So like, yes, the student was, let's say, very ambitious, but she was ambitious in a class. Like, I don't know if other teachers experience this, but my fifth period was always very difficult because it was right before lunch. And so some of these students who were in that class who were so eager to learn, it's like, I remember them because they were in like a class for some reason full of, no offense to boys, but you know, teenage boys. And they were like one
That's
of
a low strikes again.
Yeah, I don't know why it was not a balanced class. And every fifth period was like that for me. And just wanting to show that context of this was not a easy class, but they were still, you know, paying attention and doing great. So first it was the letter of recommendation request form. Also, I learned my lesson. I did not start writing the letter until I got that. For my school, it was the Common App request. So once I got the request, then I would write the letter. Because there were too many times where I would write the letter and then not get the request. So then I wrote it for no reason. So sadly, that kind of stuff would happen a lot. So yeah, so I think if you have a good form, it'll help you. And I believe we're going to share it in the show notes.
Yeah. So Hanah was gracious enough to share the form that she would use with her students for you all. So you could definitely have access to that. It'll be a forced copy version of a Google Doc. We're all about that at College Essay Guy. So then you can tweak and customize it with questions that you feel are most relevant to your class, your community, and things that you'd want to know about your students.
I also want to just point out on the form, I actually replicated that chart that is on the Common App letter of rec. This was more just to see how the student would evaluate themselves. But remember, you actually don't have to use that chart at all. So, and even for what are the 3 words to describe your student? That's why I used to ask my students for the adjectives, but you could even say C letter. I did not know my rights to this. I'm just letting you know that you don't actually have to use it at all.
Yeah, that is a real good hack. So, you know, I don't know if this needs a specific mention in the show notes. Like, I remember one time I did a session for counselors and I gave some like Google Doc hack at the end about looking at suggested edits. Like if you suggest cuts in words on an essay and you can see what it would look like with one click of a button if all the people tuning in were like, this whole webinar for an hour was worth it for this one tip at the end. So if you got to the end of this got to this point in the podcast and you got this tip around not having to send in like the cover page that the Common App can sometimes ask for students. If you are coming from a high school where you can send letters in through something like Score or Naviance or Maya Learning, you can actually, as Hanah mentioned, you can write C letter for a lot of those free form parts of a form, or you can actually not even send it in at all. So all the letters that I wrote, I never filled out the Common App form attached to it or the chart of like, you know, fair, good, exceptional, more than exceptional, 1 in a million. Because actually, even just like going through those as an admissions officer, even if it was like good in one category and everything else was excellent, you'd always be like, all right, well, why was it good? And it just would stand out to you as kind of like an unnecessary, like, area of curiosity or like a stumble as you're moving through the student's file. So honestly, it's better to just, if you have the option, just keep it to what you're including in your own letter and you have more control of the narrative there versus having to use scales or evaluation tools that are defaulted in the Common App. So we love the Common App. It's made things very efficient for a lot of people, but if you can get around sending that cover page, I highly recommend it. I think it will make your life easier and your students as well. So switching gears, I'll kind of just talk about my process a little bit, which is a little different because again, I was doing that counselor letter. So I'm covering the who, whereas Hanah was covering the how. You remember our little tidbits from earlier. And of course, also my school is a different environment, right? So just to fill you all in, I was, onboarded as a college counselor at Lakeside in the summer. And I only met with most of my students in person for like collectively, each student I probably had met with an hour, maybe 2. So I didn't really know them personally. I wasn't able to, right? Of the 38 students that I was writing letters for, I was starting work in August, and all but one of my students had early decision deadlines. They needed letters of recommendation by November 1st. So my job was just get working. And so I kind of created this workflow for myself to be able to allow me to write letters that really do advocate for a student. And, for those of you who are tuning in who are like, I don't know how to write a letter for a student that I don't really know, this section of the podcast is for you, because that really kind of was my job. My caseload was almost all students who were looking at selective colleges, right? So the culture of Lakeside is very much one that students and families are motivated to attend colleges and universities in that kind of realm. So definitely, I did feel, as someone who used to work at one of those colleges that many of my students were targeting and really looking to go to, I had a sense of kind of what types of details to include in these letters. And I also used to read letters from Lakeside too, when I was the admissions officer at Pomona and would visit the high school. So I also knew the level of detail that I was used to reading from the school. So I had to maintain that same bar with my own work. So this process took me a matter of, from August, September to October, November. I'd say about, for each student, I would spend about 3.5 to 5 hours per letter. And what I did in terms of like the breakdown of my workflow was, in the beginning, for 30 minutes or so, maybe 30 minutes to an hour, I would start with reading the student file. And I had a Google folder for each student that was passed on to me from the previous counselor with a parent questionnaire, all these questions that the student's family, parents or guardians would fill out. Some were similar to what the student had sent in, but a lot of times they provided more details about the family's wishes. Sometimes there was interesting tensions as well that I was able to voice in the letter about, this student's coming from a family where they're really looking for this, but the student's goals are here. So, they're really trying to navigate that gracefully. So I would put together all these comments and notes and highlights of things that stood out to me from the parent questionnaire, the student questionnaire, the student's transcript, any trends or things I noticed about the classes that they took, maybe dips in their grades, so I could contextualize that a little bit in the academic section of my letter. I would look at junior meeting notes from my predecessor, and also, make sure to take into consideration any of the things that they had touched on in their meetings. And then I had actual meetings with students where I could, for that 1 hour or so that I had with them, I could ask additional questions that were still lingering for me, things that I still wanted clarity around. So in the fall, meeting with students to kind of get that last, all right, you're in front of me. Tell me what I need to know to kind of, advocate for you to the fullest, and give me the most current update of your college process and goals, because it may have been different from when you filled out that questionnaire, in the winter of your junior year to fall of your senior year, right? Then I would move into the academic comments synthesizing phase. So at Lakeside, we had comments from teachers from different classes. So each semester, students would get a report that was sent home to families with like a paragraph for each class of like, here's how Janie's doing in class. Like, here are some of the areas where she can improve, or I'm really proud of her for really going out of her comfort zone with this project because she took the lead on a group project and she doesn't usually do that. I would take quotes like that if I found them in these, I had pages of these comments for each student, and I would pull them and try to include those in my own counselor synthesis letter, especially when I also would know what teachers the student was asking for the teacher letters. So I would try to use quotes from teachers that they weren't actually going to have a letter from, because I knew that quote and that content or that insight wouldn't be included otherwise. So also, as a counselor, right, it's good to know what teachers the student has asked and to have a record of that somewhere in Naviance Score, Meyer Learning, whatever workflow you use. And then I would do all that compiling. I had, kind of a letterhead with my little pretty name at the top and the logo and my contact information, like Hanah mentioned. And then I would have those academic and intellectual highlight buckets, involvement and impact and context and character, and kind of things about like the student's personal life. And I would adjust those as needed. So for some students, I found myself being like, you know what, this is actually looking better as a narrative letter. I'm not going to do these bulleted sections. So some of the ones I wrote were narrative. It was just easier for me to do that for certain students who had maybe a more unconventional story. The ratios of what I wanted to share were not equally academic, involvement, personal life. So I just used my own judgment and calibrated my letters accordingly to the student and what details I thought were most important. And then I would put together that narrative. And in terms of kind of my, tips for you tuning in terms of like how I felt like my letters stood out, I guess, in the landscape as someone who used to read a lot that sounded really similar, I really leaned into my own personal voice a lot. And I really want to encourage you as a writer. Not all of us identify as writers. I wouldn't say that I identify really as a writer. People are like, you do a great job. But it's not something that like kind of feeds my soul and that like, is something that I love to do with my time all the time. But I do like kind of coming up with themes and ideas and points of comparison for students. So that was something that actually made the rec letter process fun for me. So one of the questions in our junior questionnaire that we would ask students was, if you compare yourself to a famous character from either fiction or real life, like who would you compare yourself to? And Hanah, I remember when I asked you this question, who did you say it was? I know the answer, but I want you to share it with the...
Well, being the reluctant Disney adult, I said Belle. And I said, because she's not the most understood by her town. She loves to read and she wants more from this provincial life.
Oh, what? That's one of my go-to karaoke songs. I will not, the final 10 minutes of me just going through all the voices of Belle. Good morning, Belle. Okay, anyway, funny enough that you bring up Belle, because actually it was a letter about Belle, like quote unquote. It was actually a student whose name wasn't really Belle. She ended up enrolling at Pomona and was a student who I ended up advocating for pretty heavily. And I remember the college counselor, shout out to the Bush School in Seattle, they were the college counseling team there, modeled this out, I think, so beautifully. And it was something that like, when I saw it in the letters that I read in admissions, I was like, I want to write letters like that. I think they really stood out in my memory because they would start out with, I think it was like, Erica is like Belle in the magical world. And here's, how she, kind of is similar to this particular character who's very well known. It gave me an immediate point of reference to be able to like, I know this, quote unquote, I know this girl. Like I know that type of dynamic from that association. And it's difficult, of course, right? Because the reader, they're not always going to know every obscure character. And when we say the same things to students that we've worked with, like if I'm not a huge Marvel person, for example. So even though I went bounding as Thor, those of you who don't know, bounding is like dressing up in like everyday clothes, but like stylized like the character's costume. I did that with Hanah. It was amazing. And it's something that we would tell students that we work with is like, sometimes you don't want to always choose the most obscure references. And if you do, you want to give a little explanation of what that's like. So I would oftentimes like brand my students and kind of have them have some line or association with who they were. So, one example of this was like the Leslie Knope. The opening line for a student who I'm using a pseudonym here, Marie Antoinette, all three words, is Pond View's very own Leslie Knope, a local politician known for her can-do attitude, fierce loyalty, and endearing idealism, which she backs up with action. This iconic character from NBC's Parks and Rec is one of my absolute favorites, and so is Marie. Leslie Knope may get her trademark energy from waffles, but Marie is more likely to be spotted with something bright and refreshing. Her signature hibiscus tea. She's a rainbow-infused space unicorn among the sea of neutrals and taupe in the Pondview school halls. So really leaned into some descriptive writing there and points of comparison, right, to, distinguish the student that I'm writing for versus kind of like the general environment. And then I kind of go on to some more specific anecdotes related to the student's actual goals and experiences. So she dazzles our community with her global awareness, cultivated from spending her formative years in the UK and the Netherlands, and her unwavering commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. She'll bring articles from the BBC and encourage faculty to fold political and social issues into discussions. She's equal parts doer and a thinker, just like Leslie, and she'll be on your campus. So again, this was kind of like an intro for each student that I would do. And what it does was help the person who's reading and trying to advocate for that student really have a sense for kind of who they are in the fabric of that high school and have some kind of point of reference to be able to connect it back to when articulating that personality type and distinction to their colleagues in the admissions committee room. Another thing I wanted to mention too, just in terms of making the process more efficient for you. So kind of, we're going to wrap things up here with the podcast on some efficiency tools. One that I know is really big for me is really changing the questionnaire to be like more interesting, right? So a resource that we'll share in the show notes that I highly recommend you take a look at if you're a counselor and you're in charge of putting together a questionnaire to gather information from students. And even if you're a teacher who has your own, kind of brag sheet or request form that you send out to students or provide to them to get you the information you need, we have this list called CEG's 100 Brave and Interesting Questions. And that's something that really has tons of questions on it that are like, they range from like, what's something that you've never told someone to kind of some of those questions around like, your doppelganger or they're really wide ranging and can oftentimes provide students with just more critical thinking and reflection than the typical, like, what are your activities, right? That information is needed too. This is not a this or that, it's a this and that. But that's something that I definitely recommend beefing up your questionnaire to include more questions that, like, and maybe every year you add like a, 3 new questions from this brave and interesting question list, just so that way you as a writer have new material to work with and you fold it into your compilation, your greatest hits for your student for their counselor letter. And then lastly, I just want to close off with some efficiency tools. So we know you maybe have listened to some of the advice that we said and we're like, that's all well and good, but I do not have all the time to be compiling quotes and coming up with doppelgangers in my dreams for students. And we hear you, we get it. So a couple ways to minimize your work. One is, Hanah, I don't know if you ever did this, but did students ever share their essay brainstorming work with you?
No, but that would have been nice.
Yeah, exactly. So that's something that, a lot of times, especially if you are coming from a school that utilizes college essay guide resources and the students are already doing brainstorming work, or maybe they do an amazing workshop with our workshops team and someone guides them through these exercises, they already have a Google Doc or a book or some document that has details that are oftentimes really helpful for someone who is writing a letter of advocacy for that student to know. So that's one thing, first and foremost, asking a student to have access to their essay brainstorming work, especially if they use college essay guide exercises, gives you actually a lot of material that is, again, a little bit more different than just the typical formulaic, what are your activities, what classes have you done, etc. The last efficiency tip I want to touch on is AI. So Hanah, you were writing letters before this was really available, but now that you're enlightened and we have these tools that are rapidly advancing, do you use AI at all in your work to make things more efficient?
It's a very controversial question.
I know. Here I am, ending things with a spicy take.
Well, I am very apprehensive about AI. And personally, I will sometimes use it just to kind of enhance maybe something that I'm already thinking about. Like I remember I showed you, like, I was thinking, like, I was thinking about like a brainstorming exercise, and I wanted to think of like, what is something that has a center but extends outside?
Yes.
And so I literally put that into ChatGPT and it gave me, so that's kind of how I use AI. I'm kind of like, I have an idea, but I just want it to be more efficient in like, showing me those things. So maybe it is a student who's like, maybe have certain traits and things, and you can't figure out what that fictional character is, then maybe you could ask AI to generate a list of characters for you. Personally, I just, as an English teacher, it's still my identity as an English teacher. I just can't have the AI write the letter for me.
Yeah, and hey, I think you were there in the audience when we presented this material at Super ACAC. It was a conference with folks from the Pacific Northwest, from the Rocky Mountains, from the West Coast, who are high school counselors, independent counselors, CBO counselors. And I remember we were talking about AI and whether or not you'd feel comfortable using it as a professional, as a teacher or counselor. And, one person was like, oh, I think it's unethical because we're telling students they can't use it for their materials. So, we should be following and modeling that out. And then there was another counselor who got up and I thought she brought forward a really important point that I just want to voice here, which was, hey, my job, I have a caseload of, let's say 80 students, and I don't have time to meet with them in the fall because I have to build in time in my day to write all these letters for them. And if I could have a tool to help make this more efficient for me, for a piece of the process that I've seen the math, I know it's not this door swinging, huge make or break thing for these students. If I can make that more efficient and get these colleges what they're asking for, I'll have more time to actually meet with students and talk about the nuances of the colleges on their list and some of the financial aid programs or scholarships that they should be applying for, which really does make a huge difference in their future life. So the way that I think she put that of like, being able to recalibrate your time by using certain efficiency tools, I think just really opened up a great food for thought for you to think about and reflect as a listener of whether or not AI has a place in your school community, in your workflow to make your letter of rec process more efficient, so you can maybe prioritize other areas of your work that maybe fill your cup more, or that are really going to have a more longstanding impact for a student. So when it comes to AI and using it, again, it's a personal decision, but we have lots of guidance that we'll share in the show notes for you on using something called prompt engineering to basically kind of write into ChatGPT, have these qualities be reflected and have the letter be formatted in a certain way. And it will actually, if you feed it a source information from a questionnaire, using the prompt kind of that will provide to you with brackets, and it will kind of replace essentially like certain elements of the actual submitted form that a student sends in to you, and have it kind of be first drafted into a written formal letter format that gives you, a baseline to start with as a counselor to be able to tweak and modify and maybe change some of the details that you're like, oh, it didn't really pull this part of the questionnaire that I think is really important. I'm going to slide that in here. But it just gives you, it can maybe save a lot of time when it comes to having at least that first draft, that skeleton ready to go that you fill in with the flesh and the soul, to quote my lovely colleague Hanah. And then another tool that, we are working on at College Essay Guide that I just want to mention on this podcast is we do have a recommendation letter tool that is currently being finalized and drafted. So hopefully by the time this podcast gets released, it's either ready to go or in beta version, but hopefully, especially by the next cycle that you apply, using a tool like that to be able to make your process more efficient is something I definitely recommend. And the last technology hack I will mention too, we'll also have in the show notes, is this system that I used to develop called the Save As Form Publisher. It's an add-on to Google Sheets and Google Forms, where basically it will take the responses that a student sent into a questionnaire and put it into a Google Doc format with like your letterhead and if you have like bullets and buckets, like academic highlights, extracurricular highlights, it will kind of load all the responses and like the fonts and colors for your template into a doc ready to go. So that way you have a whole folder of them on your Google Drive for each individual student with their name, dash letter of recommendation. And it's not necessarily writing the letter for you. So I'd say it's like a pre-step to like the full dark side of just like leading it to AI. But it is using technology to at least give you saving, that collective hours of kind of like cutting and pasting everything and putting it in the formatting and all that, which does add up. It definitely can save you some time there too. So hopefully all the tools that we're providing will help make your life a little easier no matter what school environment you're coming from. Final thoughts, Hanah, before we wrap up and release the audience to their writing duties here.
I mean, counting up, we talk about counting up and counting down. I think the letter of recommendation request, like when students did request it, I just felt so honored to be part of the process. And it was such a wonderful way to reconnect with students. And yes, it's, not the most exciting part of our job sometimes, but definitely seeing it as a privilege.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like, especially when even like reading back like some of these quotes and things from old letters that I've written, it makes you feel satisfied when you know that, yes, I wasn't necessarily swinging doors open for a student with these letters, but to know that you're contributing to, the way that someone on the other end in admissions is getting to know who they are in a very condensed time frame, and using a very imperfect system. That's something that I think definitely, when you take a step back and and lead into that counting up mentality, it really does give me those warm fuzzies that I love. Well, thank you again so much for joining me, Hanah. I know how busy you are because we work together, and how much is on your plate right now with scheduling workshops and hitting the ground running with trying to serve the hundreds of schools that we work with. But I'm glad that we're able to serve hundreds, maybe thousands of listeners with some practical and some timely advice for them. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, as always, for tuning in to the College Essay Guide podcast. Any of the resources Hanah and I mentioned on today's episode will be available at collegeessayguide.com/podcast in the show notes for this episode. All right, we'll see you on the next one. And as always, stay curious.